Good evening, everyone. I'm Brenda Gunn, the Associate University Librarian for Special Collections and Preservation at the University of Virginia's Albert and Shirley Small Special Collections Library. It's my distinct honor to welcome you to this program on behalf of the partners, Albemarle County, UVA's John L. Now III Center for Civil War History, and the Small Special Collections Library. You'll hear tonight from historian and director of the Now Center, Caroline Janey, who will speak about the historical context of the At-Ready Monument and of the time capsule. Then you'll hear from conservator Sue Donovan, who will talk about the work of conservation and the preservation of the evidence of history. Finally, curator Molly Schwartzberg will talk to us about the relationship of the time capsule to the archival collections and about the research, teaching, and public outreach opportunities the time capsule contents present. For 111 years, the statue of the Confederate soldier served as a repository for materials held within its base, and these materials are evidence with which to write history. In 1909, community members made choices about what they wanted the future to know about them and about this area. Choices of what to insert into the time capsule. Now, we've made intentional choices about what to preserve for the present and future use, and you'll hear more about that in a few minutes. Curation and conservation activities are foundational to what we do as cultural heritage institutions. With regard to the time capsule, we at the library are aware that this foundational work could be perceived as an extension of what scholar Paul Farber calls the power and presence that monuments hold within a community. Farber's idea of power and presence speaks to the perpetuation of the ideals and beliefs represented by the monuments themselves. And if the belief system represented is unjust and oppressive, then that potential transfer from the statue as repository to the library as repository is something we want to address. We acknowledge this and assert that what we want to do is right and it's the just thing in our work with the contents of the time capsule and with our collections in general. Recently, I heard the president of the Mellon Foundation, the poet, scholar, and cultural advocate, Elizabeth Alexander, in a webinar about the landscape of the nation's monuments. And she posed two questions. Who does the work of remembering, and who does the work of giving voice to those who perhaps haven't had the full stage of history? Her questions are at the core of many conversations we've had within special collections and with colleagues in the larger professional and scholarly community, including with our colleagues at the Now Center. Conversations about what constitutes evidence and our role in preserving it. By making those artifacts, the artifacts found within the time capsule, accessible to students and scholars for research and teaching, we redress the erasure of the overlooked, undervalued, and the negligent and willful forgetting of those who have always deserved a spot on the full stage of history. That full history can't be written without the evidence, and the evidence can be found now in the archives. We are pleased to be the new repository for the time capsule contents, and we are very grateful to the county's Board of Supervisors for formally gifting to the university the contents of the time capsule for preservation and for teaching and research. So with that, I want to launch our presentations, beginning first with Caroline Janey, who is the John L. Now III Professor in the History of the Civil War and the Director of the Now Center for Civil War Studies. Professor Janey is not just a scholar of the Civil War, she's a scholar of memory. And that research specialization has led to the publication of two books, Burying the Dead But Not the Past, The Ladies' Memorial Associations and the Lost Cause, and Remember the Civil War, Reunion and the Limits of Reconciliation. One final note before I turn it completely over to you, Carrie, is that the Now Center is hoping to work with the county and the library on interpretation of the materials preserved. It's great to know that that partnership can continue. Carrie, over to you.
Thank you so much, Brenda, for that wonderful introduction. And I'd also like to invite anyone who has questions to use the Q&A function at any point to submit questions, and we will get to those at the end of our presentation. Going to now share my PowerPoint with everyone. I want to give a very brief history of the monument's origins and its dedication. As many of you know, the monument was dedicated in May of 1909, but planning for it began a decade earlier in 1899. And despite the fact that the United Daughters of the Confederacy get a great deal of credit because they had their name on the monument, it wasn't just the UDC that was involved. It was a substantial portion of the white community here in Charlottesville and Albemarle County. In early 1900, a newspaper noted this, quote, "Nearly every family in the county of Albemarle, including Charlottesville, was represented in the Confederate Army, and many were killed. In view of the fact that the financial condition of the survivors will not permit them to erect out of their own means a suitable memorial to the fallen, the John Bowie Strange Camp of Confederate Veterans have unanimously passed resolutions urging the state senators and delegates to pass legislation authorizing the county and city council to make appropriations out of city funds for the monument." So there was a call almost immediately for the county and city to be involved in this endeavor. Not much happened for the first 7 years of the project. Finally, in 1907, 1908, there is momentum building. And along with the UDC, the local Confederate Veterans Organization and the Sons of Confederate Veterans Organization established the Charlottesville and Albemarle Confederate Monument Association. Again, this was not just composed of Confederate groups. The committee included 2 representatives from the Board of Supervisors, as well as 3 representatives from the City Council. Among those on the City Council was none other than Rufus W. Holsinger, whom some of you may be familiar with the photographic collection that my colleague in the history department, John Mason, has been doing so much to unearth and help us to understand. So this really is a community effort. The fundraising was done by not just this committee, but various other people in the community. The Albemarle chapter of the UDC would ultimately give $750, but major funding, in fact, came from the county. The county gave $1,800, which today would be the equivalent of approximately $56,000. The city of Charlottesville gave $650. Again, in today's money, that would be about $17,000. And the original plan was to have the monument completed and dedicated on June 3rd, 1908, which would have been the 100th anniversary of the Confederate President Jefferson Davis's birth. Plans fell through, the monument wasn't finished. Ultimately, it wasn't until October of 1908 that a company was found that would, in fact, complete the work. The contract was awarded to the Kyle Granite Company. You can see part of that contract here that's housed in special collections, along with a blueprint of what the design would look like. They had picked out from the catalog. You might be able to see that they had selected a design called Virginia, and all the dimensions and all of that were decided in the fall of 1908. The pedestal was finally laid on March 15th, 1909. The stone block, so the base of the monument here, was laid on that day. And the newspaper reported that it was, quote, laid over the cavity in which is deposited the copper box containing mementos or memorials, which is what brings us to our discussion here this evening. This was a list of all of those items that were to be placed in the so-called time capsule. They were buried on March 15th, 1909. This ceremony, too, turned out to be quite a ceremony. There was a procession that included the local Confederate veterans and ladies organizations. There was an invocation offered to, quote, those who had laid down their lives in the cause of right and home and country. So the lost cause was alive and well there. The dedication would take place on May 5th, 1909. This was selected because it was the date that the local organization, what ended up being the 19th Virginia Infantry Regiment, was organized. It was also a date that fell between the anniversaries of two great Civil War battles, Chancellorsville and the Wilderness. But I want to point out something striking in this very formal invitation, looks like a wedding invitation perhaps. You'll note that it is given by the men. The men are the ones doing the inviting, and the gender dynamics, if we had time to flesh those out, are fascinating to me, because it's not the UDC who's going to take so much credit for the monument. They get credit on the ribbon and in all of the speeches lauding their participation, but on the formal invitation, the women take a back seat. It's part of the gender dynamics of the day. Before the procession on May 5th, or before, excuse me, the dedication, there would be a grand procession, a procession that would begin on West Main Street near the university. And there was a plan for this procession. There was an order in which all of this was to happen. It included the mounted police, county and city officials, Masonic orders, the United Daughters of the Confederacy in carriages, the Confederate veterans, UVA students were all to be included. But I want to point out one important passage. You'll note this passage right over here, that the colored men who served faithfully, listen to that language, faithfully as Confederate cooks and body servants during the war were invited to take place. There is no accident in this. This is part of the faithful slave mythology, that trope that former Confederates would trot out time and time again around the turn of the century, of African-American men and women being faithful to the Confederate cause. This is in juxtaposition to men and women who would have pushed back against segregation, disfranchisement, lynching. Keep in mind also, in terms of larger context, 1909 is the year that the NAACP would organize. So we can see some conversations that are happening below the surface here. Also included in this procession were school children. And the young girls were to be dressed in white and wear red sashes. Now, we have no images of the procession in Charlottesville, but we do have images from other places where this was a very common symbol of young white girls, again, the red sashes representing the states of the Confederacy, including states that didn't secede, such as Maryland, Missouri. In this particular image that you see from Florida, it even included the Indian territories of the period. The newspaper reported that the parade was a smashing success. Again, we have no images of the actual dedication, but we might look to others from the same time period and see the gatherings that occurred. According to the local newspaper, along the entire route, the streets were thronged. Nearly every business house was closed, lectures suspended at the university, and city and visitors united to make the event memorable. We also don't have time to talk about the details of the speeches that day, but I'll point out who the three major speakers were. One was United States Senator John W. Daniel, who was a Confederate veteran that went around giving lots of speeches at various monument dedications. He was an opponent of Reconstruction, had been very vociferous in his denouncements of that. And in 1901 and 02, he was part of the conversation about the revised Virginia Constitution, which was aggressively pushing for disfranchisement of African Americans. Now, he doesn't speak to these issues in his speech at the unveiling, but this is part of the larger context that's going on. The other main speaker of the day was former Confederate Captain Carlton McCarthy, another frequent orator at Confederate dedications, been the former mayor of Richmond. And I will point out that his speech was filled with lost cause rhetoric. He insisted that the Confederate cause had been righteous, that their principles were fixed in eternal truth. He also invoked a common lost cause thread, that emancipation had been bad for African Americans. According to the newspaper, quote, touching upon emancipation as one of the great results commonly claimed for the war, McCarthy contended that slavery was not abolished, but changed in form and degree and in its victim, and is more widely distributed than the slavery of Blacks, since it is a change from the Blacks to all and from one section to the whole land. So this is something that we could elaborate on and think about what he is saying kind of writ large. A final speaker of the day was a Bostonian, Congressman Samuel Mccaw. who was there in the spirit of reconciliation, and he praised Robert E. Lee and his so-called splendid Army of Northern Virginia. For the dedication itself, the veil was withdrawn by one of the Confederate veterans, Micah Wood's daughter. There was a salute fired by the Monticello Guards, and then the two guns, the two Napoleon cannon that you see in front of you, had been donated by the United States Army. Local officials had written to the US Army asking for any wartime cannon that might accompany the monument, and they were fired as well, fired 13 rounds. One little tidbit that I found interesting in looking through the collections was that there was a letter, the Micah Woods and others were concerned about whether firing these cannon would in fact danger the figure, that he would, because the bronze figure would tumble down from the shock of firing of the cannon. And the Kyle Granite Company assures them that this will not happen. After the ceremony, there's a banquet for about 2,000, and we know that much of the story continues thereafter. I want to stop at this point and let some of my colleagues take over the conversation.
Thank you so much, Carrie. And next, I'd like to turn to my colleague, Sue Donovan, who's the conservator for special collections at the small library. Sue is an expert in book and paper conservation, and she'll share some really extraordinary images from the work that she did with the contents of the time capsule. She'll also speak on the time capsule serving as evidence of a time and a place, and the importance of that in the library's holdings. Over to you, Sue.
Hello, my name is Sue Donovan, and I'm the conservator for special collections at the University of Virginia Library. I'm grateful to have the opportunity to speak to you this evening about working with the time capsule and the implications of doing so. I've adapted a previous presentation made to the Albemarle County Board of Supervisors for this talk, since the majority of the slides show the act of salvaging the time capsule and the items within it. I'm first going to talk a little bit about time capsules in general, including typical materials and their impact, and then go into more detail about the time capsule that was recovered from underneath the at-ready Johnny Reb statue in front of the Albemarle County Courthouse, including the implications for its salvage. Generally speaking, a time capsule is an enclosure made of sturdy material such as metal or stone that is buried underground, like this time capsule was in Raleigh, or otherwise enclosed in a component of a building or monument, such as the time capsule within the granite sphere on the Salt Lake City Mormon Temple, seen in this image here. Time capsules commemorate a specific event, such as the erection of a building or monument, or the turn of the century, or of a specific person, such as the John C. Calhoun statue in Charleston, South Carolina. Their contents are selected by specific communities or organizations, and they reflect those organizations. Historian Sarah Beetham notes that time capsules are frequently found under monuments from the 19 teens and 20s because they were used as part of the fundraising event for the statues themselves. The at-ready statue was a curated collection of documents and artifacts that celebrated veterans of the Confederate cause and the Confederacy itself. In this way, the people who erected the statue entombed and sought to protect their view of history to the detriment of voices of color in Albemarle County and the surrounding areas. The risks to the at-ready time capsule were great. Time capsules buried underground are at great risk of water infiltration, especially when placed underneath monuments that weigh thousands of tons. Even a well-constructed and sealed time capsule can be breached and its contents damaged beyond repair. The time capsule underneath the Lee Monument in Raleigh, North Carolina was crushed by the weight of the statue, and the contents were practically unrecoverable. Only small pieces of text could be identified amidst the debris. This picture of a wooden box with a backdrop of sludge from the Raleigh time capsule could have been an indicator for me of what was to come with the at-ready time capsule. The at-ready time capsule was filled with a majority of paper documents with one silk ribbon and one zinc commemorative badge mentioned. If water had gotten into the time capsule somehow, there could be mold growth resulting in severe damage. the risks to the items within the time capsule, and the great unknown regarding its conditions were some of the reasons why Albemarle County contacted the library in July 2020. Removing the time capsule safely and having a place for it to be assessed were important steps to facilitate the removal of the at-ready Johnny Reb statue. Having worked with tiki torches and exploded tear gas canisters from the Unite the Right rallies in 2017 and a burned cross from the 1960s, I was motivated to work on something that would mean an active step towards reducing the everyday trauma that Black and Brown citizens in my community feel, while also making sure that the evidence was preserved. So when I saw that the hole in the cement foundation where the time capsule was supposed to be was filled with water and teeming with insects, it was clear that I was in for something much more damage than I had anticipated. I was not prepared, however, for the extent of damage to the paper-based items. The time capsule contents were completely bathed in murky water. The foundation of concrete into which the copper box had been placed had expanded over time, pressing in on the sides of the thin box, causing the solder to fail and the box lid to pop off. This meant that the time capsule had been soaking in groundwater, most likely since slightly after the box had been interred in 1909. Silt colored the water brown, coated the exterior of the piles, and acted as an adhesive between the surfaces of once distinct books and rosters. As the water level rose, the contents of the time capsule became bathed in what the Virginia State Archaeological Conservator called an acidic soup. Inside the box, the acidic water had stripped away the outer layers of metal, leaving the sides of the box orange and shiny, while areas above the waterline were a dull greenish brown. Similarly, when the commemorative badges were excavated from the time capsule, the metal was shiny and bright, not at all what would be expected from metal obtained in an archaeological context. Upon exposure to air for the first time in over a century, the brilliance of the metal quickly tarnished. And you can see that in the far right picture. The textiles within the time capsule were also intact, although the small flag that was at the bottom of the box was heavily stained and only the faintest colors were discernible. I was actually really surprised that these were in such a relatively stable condition because of their organic nature, but the copper of the box and the lack of oxygen in the capsule itself may have contributed to their preservation. In contrast to the metal objects and the textiles, the paper-based items did not fare so well. Paper made with wood pulp from the 1910s and 20s has very short fibers and is inherently acidic. It simply did not have the structural integrity to withstand over a century of immersion in dirty, acidic water. There was extensive damage to the edges of the stacks of paper, so that there was no way to identify and separate one item from another. Everything felt soft to the touch, like at the bottom of a lake. I had to insert my micro spatula and dental tool into a pile of degraded paper without the tactile information I usually have when performing treatments on paper. I found that I could use strips of nonwoven polyester and capillary action of the wet pages, however, to peel sections apart and reveal the less damaged text in the middle of the piles. I was able to identify separate works and volumes based on the slight visible differences along the edges, and I tried to peel up the top few layers of each stack to reveal some text that could help identify the work based on the list Albemarle County had provided. These are a few interesting images of how the items changed after being removed from the microclimate of the time capsule. You can see that a patina forms on the bright stripped copper in a relatively short amount of time. And the image of the chapel on the far left shows how the photograph looked when it was peeled apart wet. And then 2 months later, the emulsion had become cloudy when it dried. This picture shows the components of the time capsule after my colleague Nicole Royal and I had taken everything out of the copper box. This represented a whole morning's worth of work, and we took the time at this point to make some phone calls to other conservators for advice and to Siri Russell of Albemarle County to discuss next steps. Together with curator Molly Schwartzberg and with Russell's okay, we decided to continue the salvage process by documenting the current state of the time capsule and its contents and seeing what volumes we could identify based on the pages that could be saved. I think it's important to talk about the reasons here and to pause to reflect on what it means on a number of levels. As the salvage effort drew out and the extent of damage was revealed, it became clear that the majority of the paper-based objects would be unsalvageable. The paper was just too damaged, and this was a huge part of the decision to move towards preserving what we were able to save and photo documenting the process. Furthermore, I am the only book and paper conservator at UVA Library, so we did not have the staff time to peel apart thousands of pieces of paper that no longer had any structure. Third, we knew that we had copies of many texts in the UVA special collections, which would provide the intellectual information stored in the pages that were too damaged to save from the time capsule. Time constraints were also an issue. As you saw in a previous slide, some of the items changed rapidly once exposed to the air for the first time in decades. So I needed to focus more attention on what needed to be separated in a wet state and photographed as soon as possible. The health of all of us was a factor too. Because this was happening during the COVID-19 pandemic, all of us were wearing cloth masks in the lab with the overhead fume extractor running. The smell of the time capsule became so overpowering that Nicole and I put on our respirators halfway through the day to keep from feeling nauseated. Finally, Special Collections has made a commitment to dismantling white supremacy in the archives with efforts such as reparative archiving. Conservation has similarly added reparative conservation to our priority list for treatments, along with facilitating exhibitions, digitization, research, and courses. For all of these reasons combined, we decided that the copper box and the contents able to be salvaged, as well as the photo documentation, would be preserved as evidence of the time in which the time capsule was buried, the physical ruin that resulted, and the historical moment that removed the statue. The damage itself tells an important story, but I could not commit to further time to peeling apart individual pages. From my perspective as a conservator, I think it was quite surprising that we were able to recover as much as we did from the breached copper box. While the acidic composition of the water meant that most of the paper-based items were damaged beyond repair, it prevented a buildup of corrosion products that is typical in archaeological metals, so the details on the commemorative metal badges can be clearly discerned. I think that the acidic water, the anaerobic environment, and the fungicidal properties of their copper box also allowed the two textiles to be preserved. Paper that I was able to peel off in small sections, I laid out to dry on the drying rack in the lab. A few thicker sections I sent to be frozen in the UVA Library preservation freezer. Those frozen sections are still not ready to be removed because of how wet they were when they went in. And now that Albemarle County Board of Supervisors has decided to donate the time capsule and its contents to UVA Library, it will be transferred to special collections where it can be preserved for the long term. In the meantime, the metal and textile items are being kept in temporary housing that aims to achieve appropriate temperature and humidity conditions. So what does it mean to preserve the time capsule? Years ago, I toured the conservation lab of the United States Holocaust Museum. I was incredibly moved when I heard that the exhibition of original materials is essential to the mission of the museum because Holocaust deniers could use the existence of a facsimile to justify their belief that the Holocaust did not happen. The same is true for museums of remembrance around the world, such as at Auschwitz and at the killing fields in Cambodia. It is important that evidence exists of the dark times in our history because someone can deny that it ever happened. In his talk, Conservation is Not Neutral, Fletcher Durant, head of conservation at the University of Florida, states, "It is our job as conservators, in consultation with curators and owners and stakeholders, to decide which stories we want our objects to tell. Some stories are simpler than others." The history of Albemarle County is not simple, nor is the trajectory of the At Ready statue. This history is harmful and it is ugly, but it is real. In a lot of ways, I see my profession as a conservator treating artifacts as similar to that of a doctor treating their patients. We have to treat the worst along with the best. The time capsule and its contents represent hugely painful rhetoric, beliefs, injustices, and deaths. Yet its physical presence above ground also reflects the will of communities like Albemarle County to take down a statue that was harmful to its own citizens. Interpreting and giving appropriate context to these items is immensely important moving forward. We can observe and be aware of the importance of preserving these items without endorsing what the items represent, but we have to be specific and intentional. UVA Library can preserve the time capsule as evidence and focus on reparative work in the archives and reparative conservation in the lab. These are not contradictory actions, but different parts of the same effort to preserve history and evidence for the future. Over the distance of more than a century, the people of Albemarle County decided the fate of a statue and the time capsule underneath it. As a citizen of this community, I am humbled to have helped facilitate the statue's removal by accepting to assess and stabilize the time capsule, even though it became a salvage mission. As a conservator, I respect the story of the time that the time capsule tells and the evidence that it presents of its moments in history, both of the harmful history that erected a statue and the movement that took it down. I'd like to thank my colleague Nicole for her support and her assistance always, as well as Molly for her curatorial guidance and cool head, and Ezzy Amos, whose photography was key to preserving the process. Kate Ridgway and Chelsea Blake of the Virginia Department of Historic Resources were very generous with their time and the assessment of the archaeological metals. I'm also very thankful that the county entrusted me and the library with the salvage of the time capsule. We all witnessed something monumental when the statue came down, and I am grateful for your confidence in us. Thank you all very much for listening tonight.
Thank you, Sue. Our third presenter tonight is Molly Schwartzberg, who is a curator in special collections. Her portfolio of work covers much territory, such as curating exhibitions and teaching classes. A major portion of her time, though, is spent in collection development, and her largest collecting area is books and manuscripts of the 20th and 21st centuries, though she acquires material of all kinds across all periods. Welcome, Molly.
Thank you, Brenda. I'm just going to talk briefly about some of the connections between the time capsule and our collections and some of the ways that we see these materials having potential use in the future by our various constituencies. And hopefully many of you in the room are familiar with special collections, but if you're not, we are just next door to the main library, and most of our building is underground, and you can see there a picture of some students working on a class project together in our reading room. I want to begin by saying everybody is welcome into our reading room. All you need is a photo ID, and during the pandemic, things are a little bit different. You need an appointment, and I believe you currently need to be UVA affiliated, but we're hoping over the months to open back up to our normal practices. When I got to meet with Sue and Nicole on the day that they were salvaging the time capsule, I was overwhelmed. I had never had an experience like this of witnessing something taken out of the ground and salvaged. And as I watched the two of them very carefully peel these items apart, I was already thinking, what do we have in the library? What do we have in the library? Because I knew that hardly anything was going to survive. It's very interesting that a time capsule was placed in the ground filled almost entirely with paper objects that were really not likely to survive in the kind of realistic world of anyone making a time capsule. And as you can see in this comparison shot here, you can see the remnant of pages. You can see the effect of pages. You can see the kind of striated look of this pile of sludge on the left, which might have looked something like the pile on the right when it was first put together, and when the box was fresh and new and clean and had its own procession, in fact, a couple of months before the unveiling of the statue in order to be placed underground. And on the right are some of the items that I found in special collections that are either direct or similar parallels to the objects inside of the time capsule. I had to do quite a bit of sleuthing to figure out what it was that we had in special collections that would compare with what was in the box. Because knowing that we had to destroy much of what was there because there was nothing to salvage, we wanted to ensure that whatever research value there might be, and instruction value, and even exhibition value in the box was preserved. Fortunately, the people who put the box together really liked to document their work. And I'm showing a page on the left that Carrie also showed of a manuscript list, a typescript list of what was being put in the box. And then the published article that listed all of the items in the box that was published in the Daily Progress in 1909. And this is available online through the UVA library, digitized microfilm. And I'm just showing portions of the list here. This list was extremely helpful, although I don't know why these organizers didn't use standard terminology like I do. So for instance, they used the word pamphlet for things that weren't pamphlets. And so it took a lot longer than I thought to try and recover some of what was in the box. But recover I did, and it was really, really exciting when I found, for example, this exact match between the front cover of a pamphlet that we were able to uncover in the time capsule and an identical copy of that pamphlet from 1891. It was a pamphlet really for businessmen who might be interested in setting up shop in Charlottesville. So it was kind of an advertisement for Charlottesville as a place to move to. And you can see that these are exactly the same object. In other cases, like this, I was able to find a close match. On the left, you can see some words like Masonic and textbook. Well, on the list, we know that there was a Masonic textbook included. This was a standard part of the Masonic order. And I brought up from the stacks the one that we have in our collection that's closest to the date of the time capsule, 1854. We don't know actually what exact edition was there, but a scholar could probably do some work comparing this wonderful documentary photograph of this page with copies of different editions if they really wanted to recover and know exactly which Masonic text was in the box. And I really want to reiterate what Sue said about the importance of photo documentation. The photographic documents are themselves part of the time capsule collection. In other cases, such as this, we did see Sue showed a little bit of an image of a postcard of the chapel, but we don't know what the other images were. All we know from the list is that there were postal cards giving views of the city of Charlottesville and University of Virginia and Monticello. And I was pleased to come across a 1906 postcard of UVA in one of our extensive postcard collections of the area. And I just show it here as an example of the kind of thing that might have been in the box, though probably not with writing on it. So what happens with these objects, with both the artifacts that were preserved and the photo documents of what we couldn't save? There are a lot of different potential uses for these materials in special collections, and I want to talk a little bit about what some of those uses are. I was really struck in my research by how broad and deep our holdings are in the history of the Confederacy in this region, and also in the history of Charlottesville in this region. However, they're not complete. We do not have every city directory from around this time, and we do not have every document of the city laws or every roll chart of a particular club, say, that may have been listed in this in these inventories of what was in the box. What was really interesting to me in some ways was seeing how integrated the history of Charlottesville generally was with the history of the Confederacy in this box. The idea of there being sort of Confederate artifacts and then local history artifacts is completely destroyed when you look at this box, because this is a monument to the Confederacy, and it includes city directories that are themselves apolitical objects. But it helped me realize that there is no distinction to be made in the white culture of Charlottesville at this time between the life of the lost cause and the memory of the Confederacy and the day-to-day life of Charlottesville as the way they conceived it themselves in putting it in this memorial. I think that is a really powerful starting point for thinking about how these materials and the box and the fact of the box and what was in the box can be really useful to our researchers and our students and the general public who want to come in and look at our collections. So what is the value of these? Well, first of all, it does shed light on, the time capsule does shed light on that earlier era, but I also want to note that it sheds light on our present moment, as Sue also mentioned. It is not just an artifact of the Confederacy, it is an artifact of 2020, of the George Floyd protests, of Charlottesville's decision to fight the statues that are in the city that has been ongoing since August 11th and 12th, 2017, and the county's successful goal to remove their Confederate statue from in front of Court Square. Here I juxtapose on the left the inventories of the time capsule with an inventory on the right of the contents of the UVA library's Unite the Right Rally and Community Response Collection, an archive put together in the months and years following August 11th and 12th. And this time capsule is just as significant to this period of contemporary collecting as it is to our Confederate collections. In our reading room, researchers might use this time capsule to think about any number of things. They can contextualize various books and pamphlets that were in the box. And people who work in conservation and archaeology may also be interested in doing research in our reading room to understand how these materials look after 100 years underground. There is historical value, but there is also kind of material, physical, scientific research value to these objects. Here are two of my colleagues, George Reiser and Crystal Appia, setting up and performing a virtual class. Normally I would have a picture of a happy classroom of students looking at objects, but let's be real, we're in a pandemic and George is teaching and Crystal is preparing items for a virtual class for students. We anticipate a great deal of interest in these items for our history faculty. There is a lot of interest in the student body and the history of Virginia. Some of our most popular classes that do a lot of work in special collections are Virginia history classes. And there is a lot of interest in teaching about the Confederacy, and with Carrie in particular, already thinking about incorporating these objects into her class on memory and memorialization. So we anticipate high use in instruction. This is a picture of a recent group of student curators with their professor who curated an exhibition in special collections. The three-dimensional nature of these objects means that they're likely of high interest for exhibition curation, and we love it when we can turn that task over to our students as an educational experience. Those exhibitions, research in the reading room, and even just visits to look at a specially selected group of materials are also really important part of our community engagement. And we welcome everybody in the community to, again, once COVID's passed and we have an open reading room again, to come and take a look. We want people to have and understand that they have full access to these materials. Finally, I want to end with a couple comments just about my own experience working with these materials and the fact that we've taken them into special collections. I was really struck by this paragraph in the article in the Daily Progress about laying the time capsule underground. It is to be laid over the cavity in which is deposited the copper box containing mementos or memorials, and will hold down that box. So the huge pedestal will hold down that box until the angel Gabriel shall put one foot on the land and one on the sea and proclaim that time shall be no more. I am not a biblical historian, but the minute I read that, I knew this had to be from Revelation, and it is. It is Revelation chapter 10, verse 2. And it is a description of the apocalypse. And I was fascinated by this. What is this time capsule doing here? It was meant to remain underground forever, unlike most time capsules, which are meant to represent a moment and be experienced by future generations. No, this was meant to live outside of human time, to survive in perpetuity until the end of all time. I found this really compelling, and I started doing a little research into this passage, and I came across something just so wonderful, which is that it turns out that James Weldon Johnson liked this passage too. And we have this beautiful book in special collections of his with these exquisite illustrations by Aaron Douglas, including the poem Judgment Day, where we see in this illustration on the left, the angel Gabriel straddling the land and the sea. And I want to end by reading you this passage because I think that it says a lot about the meaning of unearthing and the possibilities intellectually and emotionally of facing and grappling with the past. Then the tall, bright angel Gabriel will put one foot on the battlements of heaven and the other on the steps of hell and blow that silver trumpet till he shakes old hell's foundations. And I feel old earth a shuddering, and I see the graves a bursting, and I hear a sound, a blood-chilling sound. What sound is that I hear? It's the clicking together of the dry bones, bone to bone, the dry bones. And I see coming out of the bursting graves and marching up from the valley of death, the army of the dead. And the living and the dead in the twinkling of an eye are caught up in the middle of the air before God's judgment bar. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Molly. Now I'm going to welcome Carrie back to provide some reflection on how the time capsule will influence her teaching.
Thank you so much, Brenda. I want to pick up on some of the things that both Sue and Molly pointed to, and in particular to Molly's statement about what is revealed in the collection of items that were placed in the time capsule, and that notion that Confederate and local history were absolutely integrated, or at least Confederate memorialization efforts, as we're talking about the early 1900s, are reflective of what that community believed was Albemarle County, was Charlottesville at the time. And we can see that many of the aspects of Albemarle County, namely the African-American community, was excluded, except in certain ways that built up that notion of the lost cause. I've spent a good bit of time thinking about how the items in this collection, both the photographic evidence of those things removed from the time capsule, as well as those original items that Molly showed us, how they might be used in the classroom. And I'm thinking here not only of my classroom at UVA, but also for some of the local high school teachers, ways in which you might incorporate or have students really look at the local history. I think it's always important to make that connection with space. And here in Albemarle County, we have such an opportunity to do that on so many different levels. So I'll give you a few ideas, and I want to, again, show you some images that will perhaps be instructive. One of the items, or a handful of the items that were removed, were some mini BAWs. So these are bullets that were deposited, as we know from the newspaper account and the archival listing, that they were picked up on the battlefield in Cumberland County and donated by Miss Kate P. Daniel and contributed by her. One of the assignments that I was thinking about I could offer in a course, and it might be a course on local history, it might be a course on memory, is to look at all of the different items that were put in the time capsule, assign students or let them pick a different item, and let them talk about what this item meant, what its significance was, both at the time it was created and what it meant in 1909. What were the origins of it? What does it tell us about the values of those who were dedicating the monument? And together, students could piece together the larger collective meaning of what the creators of the time capsule had in mind. Other potential items could talk about the Confederate Veterans meeting that was held in Norfolk just 2 years prior. This was included, as were documents about the university itself, specifically the presentation of the tablets that used to be on the rotunda. They might talk about why these were placed there, what the connection was between the tablets, why the university's recognition of its Confederate soldiers went up before the county, what is the conversation that is going on there. But it also gives us an opportunity to really dig deep into Albemarle County history and Charlottesville history. I was intrigued by the fact that so many of the church associations had included their histories within the collection. And so here we can delve into some of the religious history of the county, looking at the Albemarle Baptist Association. There's also the Directory of Charlottesville. And so if we take this directory and we look at who is where, we could also use this as a mapping project to map out what businesses were at different places. We can use the advertisements for example, the Charlottesville Plumbing and Heating. That may sound very mundane, but we can find out all sorts of rich things about the community in 1909. One of the most interesting parts may be looking at the Code of Charlottesville and all the various orders, including peace, good order, and morals. What about the chain gang on page 170? There's all sorts of ways that we can dig deep into looking at what this community was like and what the people who created this monument intended it to look like when Gabriel opened the time capsule. So, of course, this is a very whitewashed story of Charlottesville and Albemarle County, and that speaks volumes as well. One of the other things that we might do, though, is look at what else is happening that's not included in the time capsule. Just looking through the newspaper on the day of the dedication, and we find advertisements such as this. So what does this tell us about race relations, both in Charlottesville and larger at the time? And finally, I'll offer one more example. All sorts of seemingly everyday occurrences, such as a little boy who died as a result of an injury. He was fatally burned. That happens, again, at the same time as all of these other activities. So looking at the context in which all of it's not just a Confederate monument that's going up, but what is the larger story of the community, of the place that we live, that we call home during this time. And I will turn it back over to maybe Brenda to ask some questions.
Yeah, there I am. Oh, thank you all so much. That was wonderful. It's about 6:53, and I think that we have some questions prepared, but I don't want to ask one question of one and leave the other two out. So I'm going to ask a question of all three of you, and you can reply if the inspiration hits you. And the question is, what has been the impact of this experience on you, on your work as a conservator, a curator, and a historian?
I'll go first with that one. I think being a conservator here through the Unite the Right rallies and having to work with a lot of very triggering artifacts, and especially, I'm talking about for my community members and thinking about my community and the people around me, being able to receive the time capsule and working with Siri and being able to help move our community forward was really monumental for me. You know, when I went into, there was a lot of dread I felt about working with these items prior to the salvage. And I think that being able to help my community was just really impactful for me. And I know that it's not a popular choice for everyone, but I think just working through those feelings, both of humility for being here and you know, feeling that that humility and being able to help that's really impacted me.
I guess for me, humility is definitely part of it, because Charlottesville and Virginia history is really not my area. And so, you know, to me, it seemed natural that we would want to preserve this item, because we preserve everything we possibly can about the history of our community. But we are really working right now on trying to repair our collecting and its focus on the legacy of Confederacy and white supremacy. So thinking about that and being aware that I'm bringing yet another item representing that tradition into the collections was something that I never questioned whether it belonged in the collections. I think it's really important for us to document this history. And again, it's not just an artifact of that history, but an artifact of the coming down of the statue. And I'm not an objective person when it comes to any of this. But I also recognize too, and this event made me recognize even more, the importance of whiteness in the history of Charlottesville and whiteness in my own day-to-day life and experience. We are a panel of 4 white people talking about this item. It's important to acknowledge that, and to acknowledge that this is a white history that we are responsible for dealing with responsibly. And so I feel like I need to keep an eye on how this collection resides in our building and how we care for it. And I think that that is a challenge that is really, really important for us all to take up and to be very aware of and very open about. So yeah, working with an object of a history that is not mine, as someone who is not from this region at all, but that I absolutely own, is really important. And I appreciate the opportunity also, just on a personal level, to watch a time capsule come out of the ground, regardless of its historical context. So for me, that was a first. I always thought I was going to be an archaeologist when I was a little girl, and I had my archaeology moment that day in the lab.
I can't say it any more beautifully than both Sue and Molly did, in terms of the gravity of these items and this bigger experience. But I'll add, perhaps maybe on a minor note underneath those things, that it's been really great to number one, work with all of you and feel the collaboration of the different ways in which we approach these items, from a preservation and archival and interpretive background, that the collaboration and working with Siri in Albemarle County has been, I think, certainly a great personal experience for me. And I hope that the Now Center can continue along those lines. And I'll also add that I have long studied and taught about Civil War memory, but to really dig down into the place that I call home and examine it with fresh eyes has been revelatory, and really thinking about that long legacy and the ways in which those tendrils continue to grip us today, and trying to dismantle all of that and bringing both the county and the university community together to acknowledge all of these various ways in which we're still bound by this past.
Well, Carrie, Sue, and Molly, this has been wonderful. And Siri, I want to give a shout out to you for entrusting all of us, and the county for entrusting all of us to work with you on this. This has been wonderful. Thank you all for coming. You out in there, out in the velvety blackness. We appreciate your attendance. Good night.